I was sitting on a worn-out sofa that had once been filled with stories of laughter, vibrant movie nights, and restless conversations. Now, it was just an old piece of furniture in a room brimming with memories of happier times. I glanced around. The dim light of a lamp fell on the dusty carpet, and in the corner stood an antique lamp whose glow seemed as faint as the warmth of our family hearth. Sophie, my 3-year-old angel, was upstairs. Her breathing was gentle and steady, so fragile in the stillness of the night. It was a reminder of how pure and bright her dreams were, despite the heavy air that filled our home. I looked at the clock again. It was past 10. Mark hadn't come home, as usual. He was late. This had become his norm, and I had long since stopped expecting him to come back on time. I sighed, trying to dispel the anxious thoughts creeping into my mind. The sound of a key turning in the lock finally broke the silence. I stood up, attempting to smooth the creases in my shirt, though deep down, I couldn't understand why I still tried to look presentable for him. He walked in without saying a word. I felt a pang in my chest. He looked so different from the man I had once married. A stranger. Increasingly a stranger. "Mark," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You're late." He didn't meet my eyes. He just muttered, "Work, Audrey. It's always work." His voice, once filled with warmth and love, now sounded cold and detached. How had we come to this? I tried to speak casually, as if nothing was wrong. "Sophie asked about you today. She wanted to know when you'd be home." He didn't even pause to answer, just shrugged off his coat and carelessly hung it on the rack, as if none of it mattered. Children often ask questions, but that doesn't mean we always have answers. And I felt that familiar pang in my heart. We had become so alien to each other that we couldn't even talk about something as simple as this. Maybe we could do something this weekend? The 3 of us. Sophie would love that. Mark snorted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A family outing, given everything that's going on? Don't be naive, Audrey. His words cut through me like sharp knives. My hands began to tremble slightly. This wasn't the man I had once fallen in love with. I was starting to realize that it wasn't just infidelity, it was as if he was disappearing from my life with each passing day. He was no longer the person I needed. But I still tried to believe in us. I still tried to find him in this man who looked at me with such coldness. He went to the fridge and pulled out a beer. I felt a storm rising inside me. "Is this what she needs, Mark?" My voice quivered with emotion. "Is this what she needs, instead of me pretending everything's fine at the park?" Mark, still not looking at me, took a sip of his beer, as if I were something he could simply tolerate but not take seriously. "She's your daughter. How can you be so cold?" I couldn't hold back my tears. "Mark, how can you do this?" He avoided my gaze, his face remaining indifferent. I felt the unbearable weight of every moment with him. "I'm being realistic, Audrey," he said, as if justifying himself. "Isn't this the life I wanted? A sick child, a house that feels more like a hospital." I couldn't stay silent any longer. I walked up to him in the kitchen and raised my voice. "And what about me, Mark? Do you think I enjoy watching our daughter suffer? Do you think this is the life I dreamed of?" He slammed the beer bottle down on the counter. I waited for him to say something that might bring us back, but his words only shocked me further. "I don't know, Audrey," he said, and I realized it was the truth. "I don't know, but I do know that I can't do this anymore." His voice was filled with despair. I felt a surge of anger. He sat there, calmly draining his beer, as if there were no problem, as if I weren't standing in front of him, filled with pain and confusion. With one long gulp, he finished the rest of the bottle and, only then, placing it on the table, said, "I need space, Audrey. I can't handle this." His words hit me like a cold slap. Space. He wanted to walk away from his own child, from us. As if this were all a game, a temporary inconvenience that could simply be ignored. I felt my disbelief resonate in my voice. Is that what your family means to you now, Mark? I asked, trying to contain the rage already boiling inside me. Mark turned away. His shoulders were tense like strings. He didn't answer, but I saw something in his eyes that unsettled me. It wasn't just words, it was the reflection of an emptiness that had been building in him for a long time. This wasn't an accident. Everything in our lives, our struggle with Sophie's illness, the endless hospital visits, the medical bills, had become our backdrop. With each passing day, this life revolved around our daughter's illness. But something in Mark, in his very essence, had grown colder and more distant each time. I didn't sign up for this, Audrey. His voice was low, almost as if he was speaking to himself rather than to me. I wasn't ready for this. I was lost. How did our love turn into this bitter reality? I stood before him, utterly helpless. Was this my plan, my path? Was this how I envisioned it? So, what's your plan, Mark? I asked, each word feeling like an effort. Leave us and start over, somewhere else? He walked past me in silence, saying nothing. His heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, like a foreboding rhythm of my heart. I stood alone in the empty kitchen, a mix of emotions swirling inside me, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. Everything felt impossible and unbearable. Later, as I lay in bed, the space beside me was cold and empty. I could hear the faint sound of Mark's television from another room, but it was far from comforting. It was as alien as his cold silence. The gulf between us had grown so vast that I could no longer see in him the man I had once married. He was a stranger, living under the same roof, with memories that once felt so warm. The next morning, when I arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was as harsh and grim as ever. Sophie lay in her tiny hospital bed, her small chest rising and falling steadily, as if she were as fragile as everything in our world. I sat by her side, holding her little hand, trying to draw strength from her innocence, from her peaceful sleep. The sleepy nurse, Janet, entered the room. Her face wore a mask of professional kindness, but I could tell she understood how difficult this was for all of us. "How's our brave little girl doing today, Audrey?" she asked. I forced a tired smile, unable to hide the bitterness. "She's a fighter, always," I replied, feeling how hard it was to speak about this. Janet checked Sophie's vitals. Her movements were quick and confident, and I knew Sophie was in good hands. This team of surgeons was among the best. I nodded, but my throat tightened with unspoken fears. I knew that with each passing day, we were growing more vulnerable. But it was unbearable to think about how Mark wasn't here. He kept disappearing, his presence becoming more and more infrequent. "I just wish he'd be here more often," I exhaled, trying to hold back tears. Janet gave me a sympathetic look. She didn't say anything unnecessary, but her gaze was filled with understanding. "It's often hard for fathers to cope with situations like this." Her words were warm, but I felt the weight of them pressing down on me. "But you're doing an amazing job." I swallowed my response, feeling the crushing loneliness that bore down on me. "It's hard to do this alone." Every word from Janet seemed to drive me deeper into the abyss of despair. Then the door opened, and Mark walked into the room. His arrival was less comforting than I had hoped. He looked at Sophie, then at me, and his expression was unreadable. "How is she?" he asked, barely glancing at our daughter. I couldn't hold back my emotions. "She's been asking about you, Mark. She misses her father." I felt anger and sadness welling up inside me. He pursed his lips, as if I shouldn't have said that. He glanced back at his phone, avoiding eye contact. "I can't stay long." His voice was cold, detached. This is madness. I felt a flash of anger but held it in. Then do it right, Mark. That's what matters now. He raised his eyes, and I saw the ice in them. What do you want from me, Audrey? To sit here and watch her sleep? I bit back a sharp retort, focusing on Sophie. She stirred faintly, her voice weak but clear. Daddy. Mark's face softened for a moment, and he approached her. His voice grew warmer as he spoke. Hey, princess, Daddy's here. Sophie gave a weak smile, reaching out for him. Stay with me, Daddy. I felt a mix of hope and sorrow in my heart, two opposing feelings intertwined and vying for attention. Mark hesitated, his gaze avoiding mine, and I sensed the growing chasm between us. He sat at the edge of the bed, his movements mechanical, as if he weren't truly present in this place or this moment. I can't stay long, he said, his voice tired, distant. Sophie, Daddy has to work. Her weak smile faded, and I saw in her eyes an understanding far beyond her years. It was a look filled with both bitterness and resignation. She couldn't comprehend why he was leaving, but she sensed something was wrong. Her eyes held a depth that seemed far too mature for her young age. It's okay, she whispered with an invisible effort. Daddy, I love you. Mark forced a faint smile, barely noticeable, and patted her hand as if it were some kind of obligation. I love you too, sweetheart. His voice sounded hollow, unnatural. When he stood to leave, a surge of indignation rose in my chest. How could he be so distant? She needs you, Mark, we need you, I wanted to scream. But instead, I sat there, clenching my teeth, silently watching as he slowly turned and walked out of the room. With every step he took, I felt everything inside me crumbling, a familiar sense of abandonment gripping me with its cold, harrowing hand. Sophie's tiny hand squeezed mine, her small presence a reminder that we had a battle to fight. A battle for her life, for our future. The room fell silent again, broken only by the beeping of monitors and Sophie's faint breaths. I leaned down to her and whispered. Promises of better days. Promises I'm not sure I can keep. But for now, all I have is hope and unwavering love for you, my girl. The silence was broken by the ringing of my phone, and Lisa's name flashed on the screen, my friend, a realtor at a local agency. I stepped away to answer, feeling the storm stirring in my veins once more. Lisa informed me that Mark had decided to sell our house. Our house. I felt anger and disbelief whirl inside me, overwhelming me. What? I exclaimed, unable to believe it. He's selling our house while I'm here with Sophie? I gripped the phone tightly, trying to find the words, but they tangled with the frantic pounding of my heart. He's insisting on a quick sale, Audrey. We need to act now, Lisa said, sitting down on a bench across from me. Her face carried a mix of worry and anger. I felt my world collapse into a single point as rage built within me. I can't let this happen, Lisa, I said in a low, firm voice, trying not to break. He thinks he can just steal my home and run off with whoever she is. Lisa reached out and grasped my hand firmly. Her touch was supportive, but it was more than comfort, it was a readiness to fight. I needed to find a way out. I needed to stop this. Leaning forward, my eyes burned with determination. We'll stop him, Lisa. I'll talk to a lawyer. I won't stand by and let this happen. If he thinks he can do this, he's wrong. Lisa nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. She stood with me, her support giving me the strength I needed. It was time to act, time to prepare. He would pay for everything, for betraying me, for what he was doing to Sophie. I would fight. Good. Fight this, Audrey, Lisa said, her voice full of encouragement. I'm with you every step of the way. I nodded, feeling the spark of resolve ignite within me. Now I needed to gather every piece of evidence of his betrayal, his deceit. I had to uncover everything that could help me stop this process. That house, the one he wanted to take, held my life, our life with Sophie. I wouldn't let him take it so easily. Lisa offered to dig into this, to gather information, to check everything possible. I tried to focus on her words, but my thoughts were still racing. He was going to leave. To sell the house, to leave us in this emptiness. I sipped my coffee, its bitterness mirroring everything I felt. I couldn't believe he was doing this to me. To Sophie. After everything we had been through together, how could he be so cruel? He's a coward, Audrey, Lisa said, gripping my hand tightly. He's just a coward. And he'll regret underestimating you. I felt my determination solidify. He would pay for this. Lisa, he'll pay for what he's done to my daughter, for trying to take our home. I'll make sure of it, I said, clenching my fists. Lisa stood beside me, her eyes fierce and full of the resolve I had been missing just moments ago. Let's do this. Audrey, let's show him he picked the wrong woman to mess with. I nodded, though a storm raged in my head. He didn't know who he was up against. He didn't know that his actions would cost him more than he could imagine. Lisa and I stood side by side, like two warriors on the verge of battle. This wasn't just about a house. This was a war for my future, for my daughter's future. And I wasn't going to lose. I stood just outside the realtor's office. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. Through the slightly ajar door, I could hear voices, muffled, indistinct, but I recognized his. Mark. He was speaking in his calm, confident tone, the deceptive one that had once so easily charmed me. I felt the blood rush to my temples. I knew that right now, in that room, he was playing his role again. But he didn't know I was playing mine too. His lover laughed, a tinkling sound, cheerful and hollow, completely oblivious to the storm she was part of. I watched as Mark handed a stack of papers to potential buyers. His charm was on full display, the same charm that had once swept me off my feet. It was his tool, his weapon. He spoke about the house as if it were some commodity to be sold for the best price. A beautiful home, great location, a fantastic buy, he said with that smiling face that now disgusted me. The middle-aged couple nodded, their expressions a mix of eagerness and caution. The woman skimmed the documents while her husband leaned in for a closer look. Everything about this scene was so wrong yet felt suffocating. How could he do this? How could he lie so coldly, so confidently? The woman with the bright red lipstick, his lover, laughed again, leaning in close to Mark and whispering loud enough for me to hear, "This will be easy." And in that moment, I felt a wave of fury bloom in my chest. It was like a punch to the gut. He was lying. And I knew this moment would be key to understanding just how deep his deceit ran. I had to stay, to gather evidence, to comprehend how he was orchestrating his game. The buyer's husband glanced at Mark questioningly. He said something about the owner, a young woman, which was me. I felt anger spreading through my body again. But I held it back. I needed to stay calm. Composed. Lisa, playing her part, stepped into the conversation. "We can proceed with the sale as soon as you're ready," she said in a tone that made it clear Lisa was already making her move. The couple exchanged glances and nodded. I watched as the buyers continued signing the papers. Each movement felt like a dagger to my heart. It hurt. But I knew this wasn't the time for emotions. It was time to act. I felt a surge of rage boiling in my chest. I had to stop him, and I knew I needed to act immediately. In that moment, I heard Mark's laughter again, his voice filled with smugness. He was raising a glass, cheerful and carefree, with the buyers who likely had no idea what was really going on. His lover clung to his arm, enjoying the moment as if this house were just another step toward a fresh start. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass, his voice devoid of any regret. I entered the room, ignoring the gazes that turned toward me. My eyes were fixed on Mark, reveling in the moment, unaware that I was there to disrupt it. This was my moment. "Mark," I said firmly, my voice steady. I walked toward him, each step echoing through the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. "I'm here to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life." Mark smirked, rolling his eyes, his face twisting in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The deal is done." "It's settled," he said dismissively, trying to mask his uncertainty. I stood across from him, more confident than ever. This was the moment to show him that his arrogance was nothing but dust waiting to scatter in the wind. I smiled, but it was cold and hollow. It was the kind of smile devoid of joy, as if I were estranged from myself, from the world where I once believed I could be happy. Too much pain, too much deceit, and not a shred of warmth in return. Even if Mark thought his manipulations would go unpunished, I knew this was the moment of truth. The time had come. I looked at the documents spread out before the buyers. They seemed confused, exchanging glances, clearly unsure how to react. The buyer's husband mumbled something vague about everything being fine, but his voice was uncertain, revealing that he could sense the situation spiraling out of control. Mark stepped forward, trying to regain control. He had always been like this, confident to the end, but I knew it was all a facade hiding his own fears. "You're confused, Audrey," he said with feigned insistence, taking another step toward me as if trying to assert dominance. "This is for the best." I shook my head, not breaking eye contact. My resolve only grew stronger. "No, Mark," I replied with cold precision. "The only confusion here is yours. If you think you can forge my signature and get away with it, you're gravely mistaken." The room fell silent. Everyone froze, and Mark's face turned even paler than usual. He glanced around nervously, searching for an escape, but this was his last act. He had been caught off guard. "You can't prove anything," he said, trying to cloud my thoughts and unnerve me. He hastily pulled out a set of documents from his bag. "In fact, I have the real papers, and you have nothing but accusations." My confidence didn't waver. In that moment, I knew I had already won. He couldn't confuse me. Mark's lover, standing nearby, tugged at his arm, her face etched with panic. "Mark, what is she talking about?" she asked, her voice fraught with uncertainty as she sought answers that weren't there. "Tell me it's not true." But Mark remained silent. His usual confidence was crumbling before my eyes, and it was so satisfying that I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. His deception was falling apart. At that moment, the office door opened, and 2 police officers entered. One of them, a tall man in a sharp suit, looked directly at Mark. His gaze was cold and resolute. "Mark Johnson, you're under arrest for fraud and document forgery," he said clearly and firmly. Mark's face drained of color completely. He turned to me, his eyes filled with disbelief and fury. He couldn't believe it was happening exactly as I had warned. "You called the police," his voice trembled with anger. I met his gaze with absolute calm. "Yes, I did," I replied firmly. "You broke the law, Mark, and now you'll face the consequences. You tried to steal my home." As the officer placed handcuffs on him, Mark's lover began to cry. She clenched her fists as if hoping her tears could somehow change the situation. The buyers quickly gathered their things, their expressions tense as they tried to distance themselves from the chaos. It was too much for them, and they left without so much as a goodbye. One of the officers turned to me. "We'll need your statement, ma'am," he said respectfully. I nodded, unafraid. Justice had been served, and it filled me with a profound sense of relief. Of course, officer, I said, feeling the weight that had gripped my heart begin to lift. As they led Mark away, he turned to look at me. His eyes were a mixture of anger and regret, but I felt no sympathy. He had made his choice, and now he had to face the consequences. I watched him go, knowing I no longer had to fear his manipulations. Lisa stood beside me, smiling, and I couldn't help but notice the satisfaction in her expression. "Well played," she said, nodding approvingly. I smiled in return and left the office, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I had stood up for myself and for Sophie. I had fought back, and this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, but I knew one thing: I would no longer allow anyone to steal my happiness. Mr. Thompson gave me a knowing nod, his gaze steady and insightful, the look of someone who had seen much and knew how to navigate even the most challenging situations. "I respect that, Audrey," he said. "When it comes to divorce and the custody battle ahead, you're in a strong position. But it won't be easy." I leaned forward, feeling the determination rising within me. I was ready to do whatever it took for my daughter, to ensure she grew up in safety and stability. My voice was firm, though sadness and anxiety still lingered in my chest. "I'm ready for it, Mr. Thompson," I replied. "I have to do this for Sophie. She deserves a stable home." The lawyer shuffled through his papers, filling the silence, then looked back at me. There was no judgment in his eyes, only respect and a cold, professional objectivity. "And what about child support and maintenance?" he asked, emphasizing the words. "Given that Mark is likely to end up in jail, this will be more complicated than you think." I exhaled heavily, a mixture of resolve and sorrow in my breath. I couldn't help but think about how things had turned out, how he had destroyed our life and our trust. But now that the decision was made, there was no turning back. "I want justice for Sophie," I said quietly but confidently. "She's my priority. For both Mark and me." He made his choice. Mr. Thompson gave me a long, focused look, his face devoid of sympathy, filled instead with unshakable certainty. "You're a strong woman, Audrey," he said. "We'll fight for what's right for you and your daughter." I nodded, feeling a surge of strength from his words. The important things had been said, and now there was only the path forward. I stood up, thanked the lawyer, and left his office, feeling a growing confidence in my chest. As I stepped outside, my phone rang. It was Mark. I froze for a moment, hesitating, but I answered, knowing this conversation couldn't be avoided. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, keeping my voice cold and restrained. His voice was filled with desperation, and I felt a pang of anger tighten in my stomach. "Audrey, please, I screwed up, I know, but don't take Sophie away from me." His words sounded sincere, but I couldn't believe in their truth. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mind swirled, and I forced myself to focus on what truly mattered. His words echoed in my ears, but I couldn't forget what he had done. "Did you think about Sophie when you tried to sell our home? When you spent your days with that woman?" I asked him the questions that needed no answers. He fell silent for a moment, and I heard the uncertainty in his voice. But I was firm in my decision. "I was lost, Audrey," he finally said. "But I'm her father. I love her." I gripped the phone tighter, and my words came out like a sharp breath. "Love isn't just words, Mark, it's actions. You let both of us down. You showed how little we meant to you." Mark's voice cracked. It was as if he was losing his last hopes. "I'll do anything to make it right." "Please, Audrey," his plea was a cry of desperation. I shook my head, though he couldn't see me. But it was already too late. He could beg for forgiveness for the rest of his life, but my decision was final. "You'll see Sophie, but only under supervision," I said firmly. "This isn't up for discussion." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft, defeated sigh. He knew it was over. "All right, I understand," he replied, his voice empty and lost. When I hung up, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had won. Although it hadn't been easy, I knew I had done the right thing. The days that followed were a whirlwind of responsibilities and care. I spent more and more time with Sophie, ensuring she felt surrounded by love and security. She became my sole source of joy and strength during this challenging time. Whenever her laughter filled our home, I felt the weight on my heart ease, if only a little. One day, as Sophie was napping, my sister Laura called. Her voice had always been a mix of worry and strength, but this time I sensed even more care in her words. "Hi, Audrey, how are you holding up?" she asked. I sighed, gazing out the window, unable to mask my confusion. "Laura, it's hard, but I'm managing," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Laura paused for a moment. I knew she had already heard about Mark and everything that had been happening. "I'm so sorry, Audrey, but I'm proud of you for standing up to him. You showed how strong you are." I gave a faint smile, though the pain still lingered inside me. "Thank you, Laura," I said. "It's tough, but I have to be strong for Sophie. She needs me now more than ever." But Laura's voice suddenly softened, almost reproachfully. "And what about you, Audrey? Who's strong for you?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on Sophie, on the legal battles, that I hadn't thought much about myself. At that moment, I realized how hard I was struggling to stay afloat while feeling a void inside that no one could fill. "I don't know, Laura. I don't think I've had time to think about that," I said, my voice sounding weak, as if the words were spoken to someone who had been waiting a long time for this answer. Admitting that I hadn't been taking care of myself while everything else fell apart burned me from the inside, as though I was losing myself in the stream of responsibilities for others. Laura didn't relent. Her voice was firm, as though she had been watching me for some time and knew I couldn't keep going at the pace I had set for myself. "You need to take care of yourself too, Audrey. You can't pour from an empty cup." Her words struck me like the point of a knife. I knew she was right. But how could I think about myself when everything around me was falling apart? How could I care for my inner state when every day felt like a fight for survival? "I know," I said after a brief pause, trying to find any response that could console me. "You're right. I'll try, Laura. It's just that everything feels so overwhelming right now." Laura didn't let go, as though she was trying to reach through the phone and embrace me. I heard her warm "You're not alone," and it felt like a promise I could carry with me as a shield in these difficult days. The next day, I visited a therapist, Dr. Martin. His office was quiet and cozy, with soft light filtering through the windows, easing the worries inside me. The comfortable sofa and neutral tones of the room made it feel like a safe space. And I did feel safe the moment I walked in. "Audrey, it's nice to meet you. How can I help you today?" His voice was gentle and kind, without the slightest hint of pressure. He didn't rush me, didn't expect immediate answers. That in itself was therapeutic. I took a deep breath, like someone finally letting air into their lungs after a long, suffocating confinement. The deep inhale pushed away the anxiety that had built up inside. "I just feel so lost," my words came out like heavy stones reluctant to sink. "Everything I knew, everything I trusted, it's all turned upside down. I don't know what to do." Dr. Martin nodded, his face calm and understanding. He listened attentively, not rushing me to find solutions. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but precise. "I understand why you feel that way after what you've been through." His voice was measured and steady. "But it's important to remember that this is just one chapter in your life, not the whole story." It sounded like a soothing melody for my aching soul. I had always thought of my life as one unbroken narrative, something indivisible because it all blended into one whole. But his words made me think. My life was a book, and this chapter, painful as it was, didn't mean the end. As if compelled by his words, I began to take small steps. I joined a support group for single parents, as Dr. Martin had suggested. I was afraid I wouldn't connect with the people there, afraid they wouldn't understand me. But at the first meeting, I noticed that the people weren't just sharing their struggles, they were finding strength in them. "Hi, Audrey," said a woman who introduced herself as Beth. "We're here to support each other, to share our challenges and our victories." When I told my story, my voice was steady, but it carried all the pain and confusion of the past few weeks. The people in the group listened attentively, their eyes full of empathy and understanding. I realized they weren't judging me. We were all in the same boat, navigating the storm together. After the meeting, a woman named Sarah approached me. Her eyes were filled with genuine respect and compassion. "Your story is inspiring," she said. "Audrey, you're stronger than you think." Her words made me pause, and then I felt an incredible sense of relief. Suddenly, it became easier to breathe, as if Sarah's words had lifted a heavy burden from my shoulders. Maybe I was stronger than I realized. Maybe I could transform this pain into my strength. Sitting alone in my living room in the early morning light, I reflected on my tumultuous journey. Sophie, Mark, the divorce, the difficult days, it all seemed to have crashed down on me, yet now I could glimpse, through the chaos, the faint but persistent dawn of a new day. I picked up the divorce papers, now signed. They lay on the coffee table before me, an official testament to my newfound independence. I sank into the chair, feeling how this independence, still fragile, was now truly mine. Tomorrow would be a new day. I could take another step forward. The legal battle had been long and grueling, but I knew I had to see it through for Sophie. Every court hearing was a fight for our future, for the stability that Sophie and I so desperately needed. I filed suit against Mark, demanding a significant portion of his assets. Though the process was anything but easy, I was determined to give Sophie a better life. Each step in the case reminded me that I couldn't afford to falter. My inner voice repeated, "You must win. You must protect your daughter." And then, the day came when the court delivered its verdict. We had won. The court ruled that Mark was to pay me a substantial sum as compensation for the damage he had caused. This money was not only essential for our future but also a symbol of the justice I had sought for so long. Sophie would be safe, I would be safe. The decision brought relief, though I knew life would still present its challenges. Meanwhile, Mark was serving a prison sentence for his fraudulent actions. He had lost much: his wealth, his freedom, his reputation. His lover, unable to escape the consequences, had also been ensnared in the web of deceit and faced punishment for her part in their crimes. I had watched them in court as they tried to justify their actions, each blaming the other, shuffling responsibility back and forth. There was no love in their eyes, only bitterness and desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to them, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. These two had received what they deserved. Their betrayal, greed, and hypocrisy, their attempts to hide their true selves, had led to their downfall. I was ready to accept this as inevitable justice. They had destroyed my life, shattered what Sophie and I had built, but now my daughter and I could look to the future, a future that was in our hands. Amid the chaos of legal battles and emotional upheaval, there were moments of light. Sophie, my little heroine who had endured so much pain, was recovering quickly after her surgery. Her laughter and energy filled our home with a warmth that had been absent for so long. Sitting with my morning coffee, watching her happy face, I thought about our future. It seemed bright and full of promise. At last, we were free from the past. I glanced at the photographs on the mantelpiece, pictures of Sophie and me, taken in the park, at the zoo, both of us happy, smiling, carefree. These photos weren't just captured moments, they were symbols of our resilience. They reminded me that, no matter the trials we had faced, Sophie and I had always remained strong. We had learned to find joy despite everything that had happened. At that moment, as I tried to process our new reality, Sophie burst into the room. Her hair was tousled, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Mommy, are we going to the park today?" Her voice was filled with anticipation. I smiled, feeling my heart swell with love. She was my anchor, my purpose, the reason I was ready to move forward, no matter the challenges. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to have a wonderful day," I replied, hoping my voice carried the certainty that would warm her soul, just as I felt the world slowly realigning. Sophie clapped her hands, her laughter filling the room like music banishing the darkness. "Yay! I love the park." Her joy was so pure that I couldn't help but smile in return. In that moment, it became clear to me that everything we had endured was behind us. The pain, the betrayal, the struggle, they were all part of the journey, but they didn't define its end. Now, we were moving forward into a bright future full of hope and new adventures. Watching Sophie play, her laughter echoing through the house, I realized this was what truly mattered. Not everything had been left behind, and not all the pain had disappeared, but a light had appeared on the horizon, guiding our way. Sophie and I were ready to move forward, and nothing could stop us.